Equality often sounds settled in official words. It appears clean and confident in rulebooks, policy pages, and carefully written speeches. On paper, everything feels aligned, balanced, assured, as if fairness has already arrived and settled in quietly without needing further attention. But step into everyday life and the texture changes. Equality becomes less obvious, less consistent. It shows up unevenly, sometimes present, sometimes missing. Not broken loudly, not challenged openly. Just absent in small ways that are easy to overlook and easier to excuse. Gender inequality rarely announces itself with drama. It slips into routine moments. In who is interrupted. In who waits. In whose comfort is prioritized and whose patience is expected. It exists in pauses, in glances, in assumptions that pass as normal. Often, it is felt more than spoken. A hesitation before entering a room. A calculation before responding. A quiet adjustment of tone, ambition, or posture. These are not headline moments. They are private negotiations people make with the world, again and again. Because inequality today is not always about denial. It is about imbalance, about unequal emotional labor, unequal safety, unequal permission to take up space. It hides behind politeness, tradition, humor, and well-meaning advice. Its power lies in how ordinary it feels. Many learn to live around it rather than confront it, to adapt instead of resist, to explain it away as culture, habit, or coincidence. Over time, this quiet endurance becomes invisible, even to those carrying it daily, especially to those who don't have to. In this episode, we sit with these everyday moments, not to accuse, not to declare, but to listen, to notice the small, persistent ways gender shapes experience. Because understanding equality begins not with grand statements, but with attention to lived reality. It often begins at home, folded into routine. Who notices what needs to be done without being asked? Who adjusts their day around others? Who learns early that care is expected, not optional, and that rest must be earned, not assumed. In daily schedules, freedom feels different. Some move through time loosely, stretching late, changing plans easily. Others calculate return hours, routes, and explanations. The clock does not tick the same for everyone. It carries different risks, different permissions. In workplaces, inequality can sound polite. A suggestion rephrased by someone else. A confident voice taken seriously, a softer one needing proof. Praise arrives unevenly, feedback feels personal, and ambition must be carefully framed to remain acceptable. Meetings end, but expectations linger. One person stays back to tidy the room. Another is already moving ahead. These small divisions are rarely assigned, they simply happen, repeated till they feel natural, unquestioned, and strangely invisible. Public spaces carry their own instructions. How to sit, how to walk, how loudly to speak, which streets feel negotiable, and which require caution. Safety becomes a background calculation, not a constant fear, but never a complete absence either. Even leisure is shaped by permission. To travel alone. To stay out late. To say no without explanation. Some choices invite concern, others applause. The same action can be read as independence or irresponsibility, depending on who performs it. Voice too learns to adjust, to soften disagreement, to avoid being labeled difficult, to laugh at comments that land wrong. Silence is not always agreement. Sometimes it is strategy, sometimes exhaustion, sometimes a learned form of self-protection. None of this is usually enforced. There are no rules written on walls. It persists through repetition, through expectations passed gently, almost kindly. That is why it lasts. It rarely feels like conflict. It feels like normal life. To understand the present, it helps to glance backward. Gender relations in Indian society were shaped slowly through family systems that valued continuity, lineage, and control. Homes were not just emotional spaces, but economic units where roles were assigned early and rarely questioned. Inheritance followed these structures. Property, land, and authority usually moved through male lines, reinforcing who mattered publicly and who remained essential but unseen. Even when women worked extensively within families, their labor was framed as duty rather than contribution. The division of labor hardened over time. Certain tasks became natural for women, others symbols of leadership for men. This was less about ability and more about maintaining order. Over generations, repetition turned these arrangements into tradition. Social customs carried these ideas beyond the household. Marriage, mobility, and reputation became closely linked to family honor. Individual choices were often negotiated through collective approval, especially for women whose actions were seen as representing more than themselves. Yet these patterns were never completely unchallenged. Across different periods, reform movements emerged, questioning customs that felt unjust or harmful. Thinkers, writers, and social leaders raised uncomfortable questions, asking whether long-standing practices truly reflected fairness or care. These voices did not erase inequality overnight, but they created space for doubt, for debate, for imagining relationships based on mutual respect rather than fixed roles. The history of gender in India is not static, it is a conversation, still unfolding. When the Constitution speaks about equality, it does so with clarity and confidence. It imagines a society where every individual stands equal before law, where fairness is not conditional, and where identity does not decide worth. The language is calm, almost hopeful. The promise of non-discrimination flows from this vision. It suggests a public life where opportunity is not filtered through gender, where access is not negotiated, and where rights do not depend on permission. On paper, the ground feels level, inviting everyone to step forward. There is also a quiet insistence on dignity. Not loud, not decorative. Just the idea that each person carries inherent value. That dignity does not need to be earned through obedience, sacrifice, or silence. It simply exists, attached to being human. This constitutional imagination is expansive. It does not describe perfect citizens, but equal ones. It trusts society to grow into these principles, to translate them from text into practice, from intention into everyday behavior. It leaves room for learning, correction, and change. Yet between promise and practice, a gap remains. The words are steady, but social life is uneven. Old habits linger. Power does not dissolve easily. Equality exists as an assurance, but not always as an experience felt in routine interactions. For many, the Constitution feels distant from daily life, present during moments of crisis or celebration, but faint in ordinary settings. The ideals remain intact, while realities negotiate around them, adapting without fully transforming. This distance does not weaken the vision itself. Instead, it reminds us that constitutional values are not self-executing. They rely on collective willingness, on social imagination, catching up with legal clarity, on everyday choices aligning with shared principles. The Constitution offers a direction, not a destination. It points toward a society grounded in equality and dignity. The journey between the two is slow, uneven, and ongoing, shaped as much by lived behavior as by written promise. Over time, the constitutional promise found expression through reform. Changes around marriage quietly questioned ideas of consent, age, and partnership. The home, once treated as a private sphere beyond scrutiny, slowly became a place where fairness and protection were acknowledged as necessary. Inheritance reforms marked another shift. Property was no longer imagined only as a male legacy. The idea that daughters could be rightful heirs unsettled long-standing customs, not just legally, but emotionally, reshaping how families thought about continuity, security, and belonging. Workplaces, too, entered this conversation. Safety and dignity at work became recognized concerns, not personal inconveniences. Courts and policies began acknowledging that unequal power could silence voices and that protection was not a privilege, but a requirement for participation. Domestic spaces were re-examined with similar care. Violence within families, once dismissed as personal conflict, was reframed as harm deserving recognition and remedy. This shift challenged the belief that endurance was virtue and that silence was stability. Political participation offered another lens. Measures to increase women's presence in decision-making spaces were not just about numbers. They carried the idea that governance itself changes when experiences from the margins enter the center of public conversation. Landmark court judgments often played a quiet but powerful role. Through interpretation and reflection, the judiciary expanded meanings of equality, privacy, and autonomy. These moments did not always rewrite society, but they nudged it, reminding institutions of their own values. Each reform arrived with resistance and debate. Laws changed faster than attitudes. Compliance did not always mean acceptance. Yet, even partial implementation altered expectations, making it harder to argue that inequality was natural or inevitable. Together, these reforms form a layered story, not a straight line of progress, but a gradual widening of space. They show how equality enters society step by step, through marriage, property, work, safety, and representation, reshaping everyday life, quietly, persistently. Education often marks the first promise of change. Classrooms open doors, but not all doors lead equally far. While enrollment has widened, continuity remains fragile. Many journeys pause early, interrupted by household needs, safety concerns, or the quiet belief that education is optional for some. Even when education continues, its outcomes differ. Degrees do not guarantee opportunity. Skills are filtered through expectation. Certain fields feel welcoming, others quietly discouraging. Career choices are shaped as much by social comfort as by personal interest, long before formal employment begins. Employment reflects this unevenness. Labor force participation tells a story beyond numbers. Many women move in and out of work, balancing paid labor with unpaid responsibilities. Work becomes conditional, accepted when it fits family rhythms, questioned when it demands independence or mobility. Wage gaps persist not only through discrimination, but through role allocation. Informal roles, part-time arrangements, and home-based work often pay less and protect less. National surveys repeatedly note how much essential labor remains invisible, uncounted, and therefore undervalued. The informal sector absorbs a large share of women's work. Here, flexibility comes at the cost of security. No contracts, limited benefits, and constant uncertainty. International reports often point out that vulnerability, not lack of effort, defines this landscape. Even within formal employment, progression slows unevenly. Leadership positions thin out. Interruptions for care work quietly reset careers. Economic independence exists, but remains fragile, easily disrupted by life events that society still treats as primarily one person's responsibility. Together, education and employment reveal a layered inequality. Access has improved, participation has expanded, but stability remains elusive. The promise of economic equality is present, yet conditional, shaped by structures that reward continuity, availability, and freedom not shared equally by all. Much of everyday life runs on work that is never clocked in. Cooking, cleaning, caregiving, remembering appointments, managing emotions. These tasks shape comfort and continuity, yet rarely appear in job titles or pay slips. They are simply assumed. Domestic labor often feels endless because it resets daily. A cleaned room returns to disorder. A prepared meal disappears. The effort leaves no lasting trace, making the work easier to overlook, even though life would stall without it. Caregiving extends beyond tasks. It involves attention, anticipation, and emotional presence, knowing who needs what and when, smoothing tensions, absorbing stress. This emotional work is quiet, constant, and difficult to describe, let alone measure. Time use surveys have tried to make this visible. They show how many hours are spent sustaining households and relationships. Economic studies increasingly acknowledge that this labor contributes real value, even if it never enters formal markets. Yet recognition does not always change distribution. Unpaid work remains unevenly shared, shaping who has time for rest, learning, or paid employment. Availability becomes a form of inequality, limiting choices long before decisions are consciously made. Because unpaid care work is framed as natural, it escapes negotiation. Gratitude replaces compensation. Appreciation stands in for redistribution. The work continues, not because it is light, but because it is necessary and deeply embedded in daily life. Seeing this labor clearly is not about assigning blame. It is about understanding how economies and households function. When care remains invisible, inequality feels personal. When it is recognized, it becomes structural, open to conversation, adjustment, and change. Health often reveals inequality quietly through outcomes rather than intention. Access to care may exist, yet experience differs. Delays, distance, and dependency shape how bodies are treated, whose pain is prioritized, and whose endurance is expected without much comment. Maternal health carries both attention and burden. Pregnancy invites care, but also surveillance. Choices are advised, questioned, sometimes overridden. Health surveys regularly show improvements alongside persistent gaps, especially where nutrition, rest, and follow-up care remain uneven. Nutrition reflects similar patterns. Meals are shared, but not always equally. Quantity and quality shift with age, role, and expectation. Policy discussions often highlight calories and supplements, while everyday habits quietly reinforce long-standing hierarchies within households. Reproductive health brings questions of autonomy into sharp focus. Decisions about contraception, spacing, and medical intervention are rarely made in isolation. They are shaped by family expectations, access to information, and comfort with healthcare systems that do not always listen closely. Court observations and public debates have occasionally reaffirmed bodily autonomy as central to dignity. These moments matter, not just legally, but symbolically. They signal that consent and choice are not privileges, but foundational to respectful health care. Mental health, too, intersects here. Emotional strain, anxiety, and silence often accompany physical responsibility. Caregivers absorb stress without support, while expectations of resilience discourage rest or acknowledgement of vulnerability. Together, health and autonomy reveal a complex picture. Policies evolve, surveys inform, judgments clarify. Yet everyday experience still depends on negotiation between need and permission, knowledge and comfort, care offered and care truly received. Safety often shapes behavior before danger appears. Routes are chosen carefully. Timings adjusted. Clothing reconsidered. These decisions rarely feel dramatic. They settle into routine, becoming part of how one learns to move through public space. Fear is not always constant, but it is present enough to matter. It hums in the background, influencing spontaneity and ease. Public spaces may be shared, yet experienced differently, with vigilance becoming an unspoken companion for some. When violence occurs, responses are shaped by hesitation. Reporting is weighed against scrutiny, disbelief, and fatigue. Questions feel intrusive. Processes feel long. Many choose silence, not because harm was small, but because the cost of speaking feels heavy. Social reactions often arrive faster than support. Advice is offered before listening. Behavior is examined before harm. Concern sometimes turns into cautionary lectures, shifting focus from the act to the individual navigating its aftermath. Landmark incidents have occasionally disrupted this pattern. Public grief, anger, and debate forced attention towards safety and accountability. Legal changes followed, promising faster justice, stronger deterrence, and better protection in shared spaces. These moments mattered. They expanded conversation and shifted expectations. Yet laws alone could not dissolve fear. Public memory fades, routines return, and the responsibility of caution quietly settles back onto individuals. Access to public space remains uneven. Leisure, protest, work, and travel all depend on feeling secure enough to participate. When safety is uncertain, presence becomes conditional, negotiated through compromise rather than confidence. Violence narrows worlds, not only through harm, but through anticipation. Understanding safety means recognizing this daily calculus, how freedom is shaped not just by access, but by assurance that one belongs, without fear, in common spaces. Media often feels like background noise, but it quietly teaches. Films, shows, and songs offer templates of love, success, sacrifice, and power. Over time, repetition turns stories into expectations, shaping what feels familiar, desirable, or normal. Advertisements sharpen this influence. They compress ideas into quick images. Who cleanses, who decides, who desires, who is desired. Even when playful or modern, these frames often lean on old shortcuts that audiences recognize without questioning. Popular cinema has both reflected and reshaped gender norms. Characters have grown more complex, yet patterns remain. Strength is still coded in certain ways, vulnerability in others. Studies on representation note progress, but also persistence of narrow roles. Social media adds another layer. It promises voice and visibility, but also amplifies scrutiny. Confidence is celebrated, then policed. Expression invites validation and backlash at once. Algorithms reward attention, not nuance, making extremes travel faster than reflection. Cultural ideals circulate quickly here. Beauty standards, relationship advice, productivity myths. Some feel empowering, others exhausting. The pressure to perform identity correctly, attractively, constantly creates new expectations alongside older ones. Humor plays its part too. Jokes rely on shared assumptions. When stereotypes are laughed at, they often survive intact, disguised as irony. Cultural studies point out how repetition, even in jest, keeps ideas comfortably familiar. Yet, culture is not fixed. New stories emerge. Old narratives are questioned. Audiences push back, reinterpret, demand more range. Representation expands unevenly, but meaningfully, reminding us that norms are negotiated, not inherited whole. Media does not dictate behavior on its own, but it sets the atmosphere. It influences what feels imaginable. And in that subtle shaping of imagination, gender norms are sustained, stretched, and slowly, sometimes, transformed. In recent years, gender has remained present in public conversation, returning through bills, judgments, and policy proposals. Each moment briefly pulls private experiences into shared debate, asking society to reconsider what equality should look like now, not just in principle. Courtrooms have continued to shape this dialogue. Through interpretations of dignity, privacy, and autonomy, judgments have reflected changing social realities. These decisions often ripple outward, influencing how institutions, workplaces, and families think about rights and responsibility. Legislative discussions, too, reveal shifting priorities. Proposals around representation, safety, and care work signal an awareness that equality is not only legal, but structural. The debates themselves matter, even when consensus feels distant or slow to arrive. Public reactions to these moments are rarely uniform. Support, skepticism, fatigue, and hope coexist. Social media amplifies all of it, turning complex questions into quick opinions, while also allowing previously unheard voices to enter the conversation. News cycles move fast, but their impact lingers unevenly. Some discussions fade without resolution. Others leave behind new language, new expectations. What once felt unspeakable becomes discussable, even if not yet settled. These debates often reveal tension between tradition and change, between comfort and fairness, between what feels familiar and what feels necessary. Gender becomes a site where broader anxieties about social transformation are played out. What emerges is not a single direction, but an ongoing negotiation. Policy conversations reflect society thinking aloud, sometimes clumsily, sometimes thoughtfully, about how to align lived experience with evolving ideas of equality and dignity. Laws matter, but they do not arrive in empty spaces. They enter homes, offices, and streets already shaped by habit. Without shared belief, rules remain formal, respected on paper, negotiated in practice, and sometimes quietly ignored. Equality is often described as treating equals equally. It sounds simple, yet daily life is layered with unequal starting points, expectations, and power. When these remain untouched, equal treatment can still produce unequal outcomes. Enforcement reveals this gap. Processes depend on institutions, resources, and trust. Delays discourage reporting. Complexity exhausts those seeking help. What exists as protection in theory can feel distant, slow, or uncertain when actually needed. Social attitudes carry more weight than we admit. Approval, disapproval, silence, and gossip shape behavior long before law intervenes. When communities normalize imbalance, legal remedies arrive late, addressing damage rather than preventing it. Cultural resistance rarely announces itself as opposition. It appears as concern, tradition, or practicality. Change is framed as disruption. Comfort with the familiar becomes a reason to delay transformation, even when inequality is acknowledged in principle, because laws cannot mandate empathy. They cannot rewrite instinct or redistribute care overnight. They set boundaries, not values. Without social willingness, equality becomes compliance rather than conviction. This does not weaken the role of law. It clarifies it. Law opens doors, signals intent, and offers recourse. But walking through those doors requires social courage, collective reflection, and everyday choices that extend beyond written rules. Gender justice rarely arrives as a single moment. It unfolds gradually through shifts in thought and habit. Progress is often quiet, uneven, and reversible. What changes first is not structure, but awareness, what people begin to notice, question, and name. Education plays a subtle role here, not only through classrooms, but through stories, examples, and everyday explanations. Learning happens informally when assumptions are challenged gently and when new possibilities become imaginable without feeling threatening. Conversation carries this change forward. Not debates meant to win, but exchanges that make room for uncertainty. When people listen without immediately defending positions, understanding grows sideways through shared reflection rather than instruction. Visibility matters too. Experiences once hidden become speakable. Ordinary lives enter public language. This does not resolve inequality, but it alters silence. It creates reference points, making it harder to pretend that imbalance is rare or exceptional. transformation, when it comes, is slow. It appears in revised expectations, in small renegotiations within families, workplaces, and friendships. These shifts are rarely celebrated, yet they accumulate, reshaping norms without announcing themselves as milestones. Gender justice, then, is less a destination than a movement, a continuous adjustment between values and behavior. It asks not for perfection, but attention. Not for certainty, but openness to change, carried patiently across time. As we return to where we began, it becomes clear that gender equality is not only shaped by reforms or judgments. It lives in daily practice, in tone, in timing, in whose comfort is considered, and whose needs are quietly postponed. Noticing inequality does not always require outrage. Sometimes it begins with attention, with seeing patterns without rushing to defend them, with acknowledging imbalance without dismissing it as inevitable or harmless. This kind of noticing asks for patience. It resists denial, but also avoids accusation. It creates space to reflect rather than react, to sit with discomfort long enough for understanding to take shape. Everyday practice is made of small moments. A pause before interrupting. A shared responsibility. A question asked instead of an assumption made. These gestures rarely feel transformative, yet they quietly shape the atmosphere we live inside. Equality, then, is less about agreement and more about awareness, about staying open to learning, even when change feels slow or uncertain. About allowing experience, not ideology, to guide reflection. As this episode draws to a close, there's no final answer to offer. Only an invitation to notice, to listen, to remain attentive to how gender moves through ordinary life, often softly, often unnoticed. And perhaps in that attention something shifts. Not loudly, not all at once, just enough to matter. Silence and